Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm going to discuss some excerpts from a paper that was first published in 1984 by the University of Calgary Press, The Prairie West Since 1945, an historical survey by Gerard Friesen. And the first quote I'm referring to is, "The conventional wisdom in North American sociology, a product of Robert Park's work of many years ago, was that ethnic minorities inevitably were assimilated during the passage of several generations. This perspective seemed reasonable because it corresponded to daily observations on the replacement of folk architecture by suburban tract home, the decline of traditional language use, the exogamy of young people, and the uniform secularism of daily life, to cite but a few obvious illustrations. In the Prairie West, others had found relatively meltable and unmeltable individuals and groups. In other words, and the latter, the unmeltables, created institutions parallel to those of the mainstream and climbed parallel ladders to success." He says, "Indeed, the hostility expressed toward the so-called visible minorities from South and East Asia, the Indigenous minorities, Canada's native peoples, and the unassimilable minorities, such as the Hutterites, ensured that ethnic identity and conflict remained a part of prairie society." So you'll notice back here, there's this perspective that, Indigenous nationals are indeed ethnic minorities, and they are studied from that same perspective. A different perspective upon the prairie native community was presented by the sociologist Linda Gerber, whose research into reserve communities was based upon the concepts of institutional completeness and personal resource development. Her survey of over 500 reserve bands in Canada demonstrated that adaptive strategies which concentrated upon either the development of individual skills or upon community development policies had become a focus of local native politics. In the late 1960s and early 70s, she wrote, "The bands in the southern two-thirds of each prairie province differed from their counterparts in the rest of Canada. The typical prairie band is larger and grows rapidly due to the unusually high fertility rates. It is remarkably cohesive, well developed at the community level, and relatively likely to retain the use of native languages. The typical non-prairie band is the obverse in many respects, being more fully integrated into the mainstream through education, employment, and off-reserve residence." Her conclusion was that the communal prairie bands and the individualistic bands of the other provinces employed different strategies of adaptation to modern conditions, and that ethnic differentiation and the development of an Indian institutional framework were becoming more evident in the Prairie West. Now, one thing that comes to mind with that, of course, is that all of the, I think practically every initiative in terms of federal policy development for opt-in legislation, First Nation Land Management Act, for example, and for self-government, have been created through the assistance of chiefs from bands in BC. And of course, these are areas where there are no treaties. And it's a very different background. And yet, for instance, because of the number of bands in BC, they tend to dominate the politics for organizations such as the Assembly of First Nations. And it really has come to light that it becomes difficult for there to be one lobby group when you have two different scenarios. And the national chiefs are, often say, well, it's not my place to decide. I support everyone in what they're doing. But the reality of it is that these initiatives are undermining and work to undermine when applied to treaty areas. So to support the BC bands in their agreements and their land claims and their incremental piecemeal approach to land claims through separate agreements on subject matters, for instance, To support those at a central lobby base is to also undermine then the continuing sovereignty of Indigenous nations that are evidenced by the treaties. So it becomes difficult. It would be far more easy. I mean, it's relatively straightforward to have a lobby group representing the domestic ethnic minority portions of those who, for example, have decided to leave their nation behind and come under Canada. To have the same organization advocating for and serving to protect continuing existing Indigenous nations, I don't see how they can do both. But that's the reality. And unfortunately, as with much of everything, also we see in the Section of 35 doctrine and what's listed there, Aboriginal peoples, Métis, and Inuit. And for instance, by grouping Indigenous nationals in with Métis, that brings everyone down to the lowest common denominator. As opposed to a situation, for example, you have in Northwest Territories, where remember, Indigenous nations determine their members. It cannot be forced on them. They view their relations differently. Who's a member of their Dene Nation, for example, is not determined by the kind of blood quantum that dictates Métis designation. But nonetheless, Canadian governments and territorial governments have persisted in that sort of separation. But in most areas, and what I would describe that is that there really are no Métis per se, to the extent that those individuals remained part of the continuing Dene Nations, for example. But in other parts of what is considered Canada, Métis very different from the existing Indigenous nations. So that's a little bit of an aside of my main point of speaking today, but I thought that quote brings it to light. So what's my point? Dealing with Indigenous nations as domestic ethnic minorities, assuming that they will become assimilated, supporting the work of a PhD, a doctorate, to determine how to make, and I kid you not, how to make Indigenous men more attractive to non-Indigenous females. Because the finding was, and these things are studied and financed, and why do I know about this? I happened to be present when the progress on this particular doctoral thesis was being presented. So this is a first-hand observation. So the finding was explained. Why this particular research? Well, it turns out that the studies have shown that Indigenous women were integrating through marriage with non-Native people very well. The converse couldn't be said for how many non-Native women were actually engaging in marriage with Native men. So, the sex lives of in attractive qualities, etc. These are all part of what's monitored to determine the status. Are we going to get them assimilated? Is it going to happen this way? How come they're not integrating more through marriage and the kinds of things that is expected to take place? And in some of the earlier quotes here, they're what was that? It was, the ones that will be assimilated, the ones that can't be assimilated, and then the reference to the Hutterites. Think of it this way. Would anybody study, when you look at, say, Nazi Germany occupying France, would the exercise, would the inquiry be, well, are French people assimilating, and why are they not assimilating? Isn't the reality in that situation that there was the French resistance? And the fact is that Indigenous nationals are not assimilating or adapting. They are resisting. They're resisting being classified as mere domestic ethnic minorities, ancestors whose ancestors are deemed by doctrine of discovery and other policies, including Section 35, to be nothing more than beasts of the field. You see consistently reference to treaties in past tense, including by even lawyers purporting to act for nations that held those treaties and have granted those permissions to the Crown. That I always find tragic to see, where the lawyers themselves do not actually believe that these are important treaties and are not prepared to view them as current documents that govern what the Crown can do in this part of the world. So to lump Indigenous nationals into such studies and to view them that way and to anticipate that is absolutely starting from a wrong premise. We do not have people engaging in an analysis that makes sense. That is, you have Indigenous nations, part of nations who've granted permissions by treaty, and where does that put them today? In my next episode, I'm going to discuss the tactics used. I encourage you to stay tuned for this one, which will appear a couple days after this one's released, that shows just how deliberate this effort is to create a falsehood that they're just mere domestic ethnic minorities, and to put them in a position, the same thing's being done today as has been done in the past. It's a continuing strategy, and it's the result of a persistent action by an outlaw nation. And that's all I have to say.